So let's all gather around these decks.
Oh, see.
So obviously this is kind of cool because we get to see some of the differences happening across the same set of sand, just depending on how moisture was settling into this place. But if we look at this, are these tracks loose and broken, or are they crisp and holding fine edges?
Crisp.
Great. The other thing that's really interesting about this is if we look out ahead, there was a nice plate that broke off. Well, this is happening right here now because I can get enough of a... But when this came in, take a look at the difference between my toes showing up here and these toes. Now, we did get a plate happening, but this is crisping through, and if we were to touch this, it's got a nice fine crispness to it. It was set in wet concrete, so to speak, which is telling us something. Right now, it would be very, very hard for us to go anywhere on this landscape and create something that crisp, because there's no longer that moisture in the substrate anymore. Okay, so
there's nothing in the bottom of that.
That's what threw me, because there was
no
debris.
I mean, a little bit.
No,
right?
yeah.
sure, okay,
Other than a piece of crust fell off at the top.
great. Okay, so these are all just things that will stack up, and we can work through this. But yeah, we had good wind, right? But does that mean that it's always going to be? Does it mean if there's wind on a landscape that it's always going to be filling every track with little bits of debris and everything everywhere?
Might blow it out.
It might blow it out. It could keep scouring it through. The other thing to think about is that it would, now granted, if these were made last night, I guess that I should actually really look at these before I start going, so let's come over here. If these were made last night, we haven't had any wind, so they're there's no way. Yeah, those are strong. Okay, so when we come back to it again, you see this negative space in here? These, we can see it between the little toes. We can see it up in here. We can see really nice negative space in here too. We can actually see, this is kind of cool, we can actually see where there's still some moisture that was melting the chunks of sand. It was broken, and the chunk of sand itself has kind of a melted appearance. This would be extremely hard to reproduce right now. Anywhere we go, we will not be able to reproduce that. That's because there was moisture in the sand.
Whereas 2 days ago, it sleeted and stuff.
Exactly.
So what's the answer?
So the answer was, how was it framed? So
Today,
was it
yesterday,
today,
or old.
yesterday, or older? So
it's old.
it's older.
So why wasn't it yesterday?
Because the still would probably be too dry yesterday, because the day before, yesterday was Saturday, Friday was just windy and dry.
No, we had it sleeting and stuff.
Oh, was it sleeting on Friday?
So Dave brought up that some people are.
Great.
That's why I put yesterday.
Some people
That makes
are.
sense.
Texture and then no texture.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay.
So there's some people who are saying like Friday evening, Friday night, or Saturday early in the morning could have all been
Where it was
moist
still moist
still.
enough.
Yeah.
Right, great.
So-
I'll totally take that.
So
for
that's
sure.
what I was thinking.
Yep.
You have to accept Saturday.
Yeah,
or-
absolutely. Yeah, so that was just a matter of a poor worded question. Yeah.
I think
My work is done here.
So
So
just so everybody knows, this is the difference here is, was this made yesterday or today or yesterday? And the answer, yesterday, is acceptable, because there was sleeting on Friday that could have created some of this moisture that held here. I didn't know there was sleeting on Friday.
But it could be 2 days ago, it could be older.
Yeah, so I would suspect
It's not fresh.
that if I had to age these tracks and just kind of knowing what happened, I wasn't here on that for that little snowstorm thing that we got on Friday. I would suspect that the amount of moisture that is in these tracks means that there was more moisture than we had on Friday.
Yeah, Friday was weak.
That's what I would say. I wasn't here, so I don't really know. I don't care. We'll totally accept that, but I would, to create that much moisture says that there was more than just some random snowflakes hitting the ground.
So your best guess would be held?
Oh, well, I don't know when the last good.
2 days or more?
Yeah.
I was gonna say I was here Friday. There wasn't.
When you were here, how much did it? Did you
How much did it come down?
I didn't see it. I mean, just these little pinks.
Oh,
just
okay.
I mean, it's tiny.
Tiny.
Because when I was
Tiny.
driving up, I mean, I was windshield wipers on, heavy
not
sleet, everything's covered in white, so not here. Okay. So then, yeah, then
Those
it
little
was
white
likely
balls.
older.
Yeah, so it's, and we'll accept that just because people had some weather events. But this is what's so cool about aging. All aging comes down to is definitively a function of knowing the weather.
Yep.
If you don't know the weather, it's very hard to age stuff. We can come in and we can make pretty good guesses about stuff. If we just all of a sudden showed up right here and we're like, oh, this is cool, I wonder where we're at. And we look down, we're like, oh, that's cool, there's coyotes here. Or maybe it's a black-backed jackal and we're in Africa somewhere, who knows, it doesn't matter. We could look down at this and say, okay, this was made when it was moist. And then we would look around and we would be looking at the actual nature of the landscape and trying to figure out how much drying has occurred on this landscape. Obviously, if it had just rained a lot, we would be able to tell that. And so as we walked across this, we would calibrate to it, and we would come up and be like, oh, the dunes are all dry, and then we'd come down and all of a sudden on all of the whatever facing side of the dunes, it's still wet. And we're like, oh, it actually hasn't had too much time.
Casey, I have a problem with this.
Great.
You can see the tiny little claw prints.
Yeah.
Nothing has blown into this track, just a little bit of crumble.
Yeah.
And it gets dewy out here at night. You get the weather, the temperature changes, the dew settles. And I just do not think if this was older than a few hours, you'd be able to see those tiny ass little tracks. Those tiny ass little claw prints.
Casey, would you mind if I said a few things before we
go
jump
ahead.
in? So I one time did the whole exercise where you make a track every day next to each other, or like every couple hours. And the first day I started, it was right after rain. Everything was super fresh. And 3 weeks later, what my little setup looked like was perfectly fresh, detailed track with everything from 3 weeks ago. Slightly freshish looking track that had worn because the soil had dried the next day, and then nothing. Everything else had blown out except, so I'd make a track and like hours later it'd be gone, but then 3 weeks ago track is still perfect. And so I think even though we had all this wind, even though, I mean, this right here, the moisture holds the track really, really well. And so,
But I don't think you can prove it.
okay, here's the one other, it's okay to say you don't think you can prove it, but you have to provide some alternative evidence. Did anybody notice any water droplets or moisture accumulating on their tents last night? It was perfectly dry. On my tent, I got it this morning, it's still dark, no moisture anywhere.
We put a tarp over your tent last night for you because we care so much, and then we took it down this morning.
I agree. The only other thing, because I was thinking that, but then usually with the wind you get more edge erosion. It does round a little bit, right? Particularly with sand, just the sandblast effect. So that's
The other thing is this is a protected area, you guys. Like we're not up on top.
Exactly. We're in one of the quietest spots. We're literally surrounded in wind everywhere.
And this is a specialist level question too. I mean, this is not a question you ask at a.
No, I mean I went back and forth,
But isn't this a subjective? How much of the track is actually preserved by the moisture versus? I mean, isn't that a subjective call though?
Well,
in other words, like, couldn't you? It seems to me like you could make a case that if a coyote just went through here today, it's going to look. I mean, it's going to have defined edges, I would think. Or even like this morning.
Yeah, I did that.
Yeah. It's not going to have defined edges right now.
Yeah.
it will be very hard to reproduce this.
You can't.
This morning, like
This is look, I can pick this piece up and move it. That is very hard to get a central piece of the track and be like, okay, so what we could do here is say, okay, maybe And maybe this spot was wetter still this morning to create that, and we can be like, all right, well, let's start actually removing layers and see how far down we would have to get to have sand that would start to hold tracks like this one. Okay, here we go. Now we are beginning to get into things that create stuff like that.
Okay.
There's always going to be subjectivity to everything in tracking. However, every track on this landscape, even on the full open dunes, we can see the ones that came last night and this morning because they are crystal clear, beautiful tracks set as perfect stamps in loose sand. It's dry. This sand was not dry.
Okay.
This is an older track. This is one of at the heart of so much of good tracking, and one of my favorite things to do with folks is to find really beautiful tracks and make a one next to it before they see it and ask them which one is fresher. The most common thing is people will point at the good, clean, crisp one and say, that one's the one we want to follow.
Right.
That's actually 4 or 5 days. It could be 2 weeks old, whatever it is.
So, but if it was, okay, let's say if it was different substrate, but that would be more of a newer track because you didn't have anything actually falling in or any breaking of the track walls. So it's a matter of the sand, basically, you're saying. So it depends, because I mean, to me that looks like a new track.
Yep.
But that would be depending on the substrate. In the sand, that would be an older track because of the moisture.
Exactly.
Okay, but other situations, what I'm trying to get to is that actually looks like a newer track.
Absolutely.
In general.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It catches our attention.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a tricky question.
Exactly, and that's why we asked it.
Yeah.
And not for trickery, but because
Well,
this
not,
is
yes, just a good learning
it's
experience.
a very valuable skill in this.
Yeah.
So what we want to be able to do is differentiate beautiful tracks from fresh tracks. And so again, coming back to all of this stuff, all of this is, and this is what's so cool, is we stay on landscapes and calibrate to weather and to the place, because all of this is a matter of calibration. And the more we know, it's, you know, if we'd, what would be so cool is if we got like a good rain, tracks come down, let's say a good rain came on Wednesday night. Tracks come down, they're beautiful, and then on Friday morning there was a light sprinkle that beat up the sand enough. Like if you take sand castles and you start pouring water on them, they begin to melt.
Right.
And then it's so cool because you can be like, nice, this track was made, and in fact, there's all these different levels, but you could say beautiful. These tracks were made after that first really good rain, and then they got beat up. So this track was made probably on the night after the rain, as the land, because it rained all night and it was super shitty. It rained until 6:30 in the morning, say, and we're like, cool. These tracks came after that. Maybe they were out during the day because it was cloudy and they were out ripping around all day. But we're like, but we know it got rained on before that, so yeah, probably came, maybe it was that morning after the rain.
Right.
And all of that comes from knowing the weather. And so this is the same deal. We can just gauge how much moisture was in there. All the other fresh tracks on the landscape right now, they can be beautiful, but they're not like that.
They're not going to hold. You're saying they're not going to last.
Exactly.
That crisp
They don't
wall
have,
right now.
yeah, they're not concreted into the earth. They are perfect imprints in soft, in basically fine depths.
But if they sunk in that deep, there'd be a lot of cave in. All those edges would be all caved in and stuff like that.
So here's my question on this one, if you don't mind. So this this print, if we filled it in, this new one that you made, if we filled it in after it kind of dried and then blew it out, could we get the same print? Like, could wind have knocked that, like the concrete? If we, like when you have a print that's in ice and you blow the soft snow out and then there it is, and it looks pretty crisp. Is that doable?
That all depends on the integrity of the substrate.
Right, that's why I'm going with. If it's like concrete.
If there were a lot of clays on the soil and stuff, this is firm, but it's in very fine sand.
Yeah.
So if we put any significant force on it, so if we fill one of these tracks in with...
That one already kind of caved in. You could try blowing that one out a little bit. See how...
So it's holding up pretty well.
Yeah.
But still, if we filled it up with sand and blew it all out, it would probably come apart pretty good.
It was just so clean. That was what I was thinking.
So it's the weather and the protectedness of the area as well.
Yeah, and that's what's so cool about this. These same tracks out on the side of a dune that's catching a lot of wind will look very different. And then and this is why trailing is so good, because trailing, the animal of the trail changes insanely. What the track looks like here is going to look very different than it looks up here. And if we get up here, we'll be like, oh, old tracks. We come down here, or whatever, we could say maybe these are fresh tracks. But when we come down there, we're like, ah, shit, it's old. We're following a 3-day-old coyote. Okay, cool. And so part of the job of trailing is to be able to work your trail through 1,000 different appearances across the landscape that literally are making the age of the appearance look different. Right. And they're aging throughout a day. So if you start on a fresh trail, it's going to look different on a south-facing shitty scree slope than it is on the deep north-facing forests. Right. And it ages throughout the day that you're actually trailing it. And this is why that is a huge thing to. That's why this stuff demands so much of us. Yeah. Which is why it's so cool.
One little thing I'll throw out there too is in clay. This is dramatic because you end up with tracks that will last for months and months, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of years, where you have like perfect tracks. And so in clay, what happens is you get these, after rain, all these tracks get formed, and then you get this fine layer of dust over several weeks that forms on top of everything that you end up tracking on, but it fills up all the tracks and stuff, and you can blow them out, and there's a beautiful, perfect impression of a foot months or, millions of years later sometimes.
Wow. Did you get all this on video?
I did. All 16 minutes, 38 seconds.
That's some cool stuff, though. That's really cool.
Basically.
I think this is a really good lesson, guys, for everyone.
It is. Just when you think you have something down, man, it's just totally different. But that's good.
Just because it looks good is more of it's more of a lesson about moisture in the substrate than it is about how fresh it is.
Right.
Like moisture when the track was made.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.